So Channel 9 decides to go and cover it on television for the first time. So we'd never seen coverage of the West Indies, of a West Indies tour before that. And this is West Indies still on top, the crowds at their peak of zaniness, very different from what we see today, where it's much more sparse, the crowds. So there's a huge fascination. I vividly recall watching Sports World on a Sunday morning with Bruce McAvaney and Keith Stackpole wrapping up the cricket, and Bruce just wide-eyed saying, the West Indies, that looks like a great place to go for a weekend, which, as we'll find out, many people had the same view watching that series on television. So there's more of that later, but West Indies win that series 2-1. There is a lot of bad blood in that series. There's the idea of Australia being tough, trying to take it to the Windies. There's stories about Australian coach Bob Simpson briefing Australian journos on the way over to say, please write negative stories about Viv Richards. Please needle Viv Richards, who's the West Indies captain. And that gets us to this really funny scenario that after the fourth test where the West Indies have secured their victory, Viv is at his press conference with a cigar in hand, holding court, where there's some questions about, you know, what he thinks of Australia's challenge during the series. And I won't read it all, but it includes this. He first of all, he opens up by saying the Bobby Simpsons have been shouting their mouths off. And then he says, you can quote me. Oh, I'm not doing this in a Viv Richards accent, as saying, he is a moaner and a bad loser. He goes on to say, he's a very sour sort of loser. We dismiss anything that Simo says. And then he finishes, I'm going to tell you that again. Bobby Simpson ain't our cup of tea at all. So this is an extraordinary attack, which I think it's fair to say there's probably some Australians in the team and around and in the media who are not completely displeased by this attack, because they probably hold similar views at times around Bob Simpson. So it's very, very bad blood in that series. This is Tony Gregg's summary of the series, which just tells you where Australia need to get to and why this series and beating the West Indies was such a big deal.
These winners wanted to be sneerers rather than grinners. However, regardless of their behaviour and their tactics, they proved they were still the best in the world. For the Australians, their Everest is still to be climbed.
So that's the feeling of Everest still to be climbed. I think we talk about probably winning in India is our Everest now. The West Indies, winning in the West Indies was the absolute Everest. In fact, just beating the West Indies was the Everest at that point. There's one footnote too to that tour, which kind of leads into, there's a guy called Roland Fishman, who, I'll make the distinction, he was a writer, not a cricket writer, who was a connection of Greg Matthews, of course, who goes on that tour, hangs around the team and everything that was going on in that tour, and writes a book. Now, I think probably the people that were talking to or met with Roland Fishman during that time thought he was going to write the traditional cricket tour book about what happened on the field. No, this was a book about what a West Indies tour was like off the field. It's actually a really interesting book. I would highly recommend it. It's a bit of a curio, but it's quite an interesting book. A lot of it is about Roland Fishman going out to nightclubs in the Caribbean and getting knocked back in advances to women, which is, that makes up a fair percentage of the book. But be that as it may, it causes huge controversy in Australia because it makes reference to the off-field life of a West Indies tour, which, if you read between the lines, that was not necessarily known by everyone who back in Australia, particularly the families of cricketers who were back in Australia. So with no names, no pack drill, there was a lot of aspersions as to the behaviour of Australian players that related to in that book was hugely controversial, and he was basically excommunicated from any involvement in cricket ever since. Worth a read. But what it did say in this book is it painted a picture of how interesting life is in the Caribbean, because it was more about life in the Caribbean more than the game itself, which, combined with us seeing television of the tour, results in a lot of curiosity from Australian fans to say, if I'm ever going to go and watch Australia play over